Consider this a public service announcement delivered in the key of dark comedy. Tonight, we've gathered 10 pristine examples of people who looked directly at a terrible idea and thought, yeah, that's probably fine. These are not tragic misunderstandings. They are masterpieces of self-removal, case studies in ego, impatience, and the breathtaking human ability to turn a minor inconvenience into a full-scale funeral arrangement. Some people leave this world heroically. Others leave because they picked a fight with physics, chemistry, gravity, or an appliance designed for office use. This list is for the second group, so pay close attention because every story tonight is a detailed lesson in what not to do. Unless your long-term goal is to become an internal memo, a safety warning, or an anecdote told by paramedics over lunch. Welcome to the Hall of Fame of Terminal Stupidity. Let's begin. 1. The water cooler revenge plot. There are bad days at work. Then there are the kind of days that end with a company-wide safety memo and a janitor needing therapy. Gary had just been fired. Not laid off, not gently transitioned into a new chapter. Fired. Officially and completely removed from a job in which his main contribution, according to at least one former coworker, had been converting oxygen into complaints. Now, a normal person reacts to termination in one of several predictable ways: sadness, anger, drinking, updating LinkedIn with suspicious optimism. Gary chose vengeance. And not the normal kind either. He wasn't going to slash tires or steal office supplies. No, Gary's brain, operating on cheap beer, spite, and what appeared to be no adult supervision whatsoever, came up with a plan aimed at the very center of office civilization: the communal water cooler. His idea was unspeakably stupid, biologically hostile, and logistically complicated in a way only an idiot with too much time could appreciate. He intended to climb up and relieve himself directly into the cooler reservoir, thus poisoning workplace morale at the molecular level. There was, however, one challenge. He needed height. That's when his eyes fell on the instrument of his downfall: a rolling office chair. Now, for anyone who has somehow avoided learning this the easy way, office chairs are designed to move. Their little plastic wheels exist specifically to reduce friction, so you can glide effortlessly from your desk to the printer without standing up like some kind of peasant. What they are not designed for is vertical load bearing. They are not stools. They are not ladders. They are certainly not revenge platforms. Gary disagreed. Later that night, under the glow of fluorescent lights and the low hum of a building full of people who were no longer his problem, he broke back into the office. He rolled the chair into position beside the water cooler and began climbing it with the grace of a sedated bear on roller skates. One foot on the seat, then the other, arms flailing slightly, trousers already in the early stages of a very bad decision. For one glorious second, he actually made it. He stood there, wobbling on top of his mobile throne, king of petty revenge, preparing to leave behind what he no doubt believed would be a legendary final insult. Then the chair remembered what it was. It rolled. Hard. Instantly. The wheels shot backward across the smooth office floor, and Gary, now fully committed to the wrong mission at the wrong altitude in the wrong pair of pants, came crashing down. But not onto carpet. Not onto the forgiving emptiness of office shame. No, his head found the sharp corner of his old desk with the sort of precision usually reserved for guided missiles. The impact was immediate and final. When the cleaning crew arrived the next morning, they found a scene so confusing it took several minutes to even understand what kind of crime against dignity had occurred. Gary was dead. His pants were halfway undone. The water cooler remained untouched, pure, innocent, unpolluted. In the end, Gary did leave a mark on the company, just not the one he planned. He became a cautionary tale, an HR nightmare, and the reason the office quietly introduced a new rule: do not stand on rolling chairs. 2. The man who tried to stop a car with his body. In a quiet suburb of Germany lived a man named Klaus, whose greatest talent was possessing absolute confidence in ideas that had absolutely no chance of working. Klaus believed deeply in three things: 1. His mechanical instincts. 2. His personal toughness. 3. The completely false idea that physics was more of a guideline than a rule. His pride and joy was a spotless Volkswagen sedan, the kind of car he polished every weekend like it was a sacred artifact rather than a moderately priced piece of German engineering. One bright Saturday morning, Klaus rolled the car onto his gently sloping driveway for its weekly ceremonial wash. And then he made the first mistake. He forgot the parking brake. Now, this is a small oversight, a minor lapse, the sort of thing that usually ends with a slow roll and an insurance claim. Unfortunately, Klaus was not the type of man who allowed problems to solve themselves in normal ways. As he lovingly scrubbed soap across the hood, the car began to move. At first it was subtle, a slow creep backward, like the vehicle was quietly attempting to escape an awkward conversation. But driveways with slopes have a funny habit. They turn small mistakes into momentum. Within seconds, the Volkswagen was rolling faster, heading straight toward the neighbor's beautifully maintained brick wall. Now, a rational person has options in this situation. You could let the car roll and call insurance. You could jump inside and slam the brakes. You could even attempt to steer it away. Klaus considered none of these. Instead, his brain performed an Olympic-level leap over common sense and landed on a plan so stupid it deserved its own chapter in engineering textbooks. He would stop the car. With his body. Klaus sprinted into the path of the rolling vehicle, planted his feet firmly on the pavement, and extended both arms forward like a human stop sign. In his mind, this was the heroic moment. Man versus machine. Sheer willpower versus German engineering. A cinematic confrontation where the brave homeowner halts the runaway car with raw determination. Unfortunately for Klaus, a Volkswagen weighs roughly 3,000 pounds, and humans are mostly made of water, optimism, and fragile bones. The car did not slow down. It did not hesitate. It did not even acknowledge the performance. It simply continued rolling downhill with the quiet indifference of a physics equation solving itself. The impact was brief and deeply educational. Klaus's heroic stance collapsed instantly as the bumper hit his legs, folding him like a badly packed suitcase and pushing him backward toward the brick wall. In a matter of seconds, he achieved something very rare in life. He became both the brake pad and the collision zone. The Volkswagen finally stopped, but only after crushing its owner between two extremely solid surfaces. The car he loved, and the wall he was about to pay to repair. When police arrived, the report was surprisingly simple. Cause of death? Terminal failure to understand momentum. Klaus had died exactly the way he lived. Confident, determined, and spectacularly wrong. 3. The woman who opened a bus door at 60 miles per hour for a cigarette. There is a special kind of psychological torture known only to two groups of people: submarine crews, and heavy smokers on long public transportation trips. For Brenda, a 12-hour bus ride from Glasgow to London felt less like travel and more like a slow descent into nicotine withdrawal madness. Every passing mile marker made the craving worse. Her brain was no longer thinking about scenery, conversation, or basic life goals. It was thinking about exactly one thing: a cigarette. She tried everything: chewing gum, staring out the window, reading the safety pamphlet. None of it worked. The nicotine monster in her brain was now pounding on the inside of her skull like a debt collector with a baseball bat. Then the bus pulled over onto the shoulder of the motorway. To everyone else, this was a minor delay. To Brenda, it looked like freedom. The driver's voice crackled over the intercom. "For your safety, please remain seated. No one is to exit the vehicle." To a normal passenger, this instruction would be interpreted as a safety precaution. To Brenda, it sounded like a personal attack. Her last remaining rational brain cell quietly packed its bags and left the building. With the determination of a soldier storming a beach, Brenda marched down the aisle toward the emergency exit. Other passengers watched nervously. They knew this was a bad idea. Brenda, however, was operating under a completely different set of priorities. Now, let's pause for a quick physics lesson. Opening a door on a moving bus traveling at 60 miles per hour does not create a gentle breeze. It creates a violent blast of air, powerful enough to turn the inside of the vehicle into a small wind tunnel. When Brenda pulled the emergency lever, the door burst open. Instantly. The cabin filled with a roaring hurricane of air. Magazines flew. Chip bags exploded. Someone's newspaper disintegrated like confetti at a parade. A normal person would have immediately slammed the door shut. Brenda saw something else. A challenge. She quickly realized lighting a cigarette inside this indoor tornado would be impossible. So her brain came up with a solution that can only be described as breathtakingly stupid. She would lean outside the bus, using the bus itself as a windshield. Clinging to the doorframe with one hand, she stuck her upper body out into the rushing highway air, trying desperately to light her cigarette. For a moment, she looked like some kind of tragic human gargoyle hanging off the side of a moving vehicle. The wind was brutal, a solid wall of force pressing against her body. Her grip lasted about 2 seconds. Then the air peeled her off the bus like a sticker. Her scream disappeared instantly into the rushing wind as she was thrown onto the highway directly behind the vehicle. And unfortunately for Brenda, the bus had not yet finished passing. The horrified driver eventually brought the vehicle to a stop several hundred feet down the road. When authorities arrived, the scene told the entire story. There, on the rough asphalt, lay the final symbol of Brenda's quest. A single cigarette, perfectly intact, still unlit. She died chasing a smoke she never even got to light. Nicotine had won the argument, just not in the way she expected. 4. The man who tried to tag a bull shark from a tiny boat. Florida is a place where reality occasionally takes a day off. It is a state where headlines like, "Man wrestles alligator over sandwich," barely qualify as unusual, and where certain individuals develop the dangerous belief that watching a few documentaries makes them experts in wildlife. Larry was one of those individuals. Larry loved the ocean. Larry loved sharks. And Larry loved the idea of telling people he was basically a marine biologist. The only problem was that Larry was not a marine biologist. He was a man with a 12-foot aluminum fishing boat, a cooler full of cheap beer, and an ego large enough to require its own zip code. His greatest ambition was to tag a bull shark. Now, for those unfamiliar with the species, a bull shark is not the friendly golden retriever of the sea. It is a muscular torpedo of teeth, aggression, and bad attitude. A predator perfectly designed by millions of years of evolution to dominate murky coastal waters. Real scientists study them from large research vessels with professional equipment and years of training. Larry had a pointy stick with a plastic tag on the end, and confidence. Lots of confidence. One afternoon, while cruising along the shallow coastline, Larry spotted what he had been waiting for, a massive bull shark gliding through the water just beneath the surface. "There she is," Larry shouted to his friend, who had come along mainly because Larry promised free beer and had not fully understood what the trip involved. Larry fired up the small outboard motor and began chasing the shark like a man attempting to irritate a submarine. The tiny boat buzzed across the water while the shark circled below, increasingly annoyed by the noise and shadow overhead. "Just a little closer," Larry muttered, leaning dangerously over the side with his tagging pole. His friend began suggesting ideas such as leaving immediately or not provoking apex predators from unstable floating objects. Larry ignored him. Finally, with a dramatic lunge, he managed to jab the plastic tag into the shark's dorsal fin. For one glorious moment, Larry celebrated. He pumped his fist in the air like he had just solved climate change. But the shark had a different interpretation of events. From its perspective, a noisy metal thing had chased it across the water and then stabbed it. And bull sharks are not famous for their patience. The shark turned, fast. Then it did exactly what nature designed it to do. It attacked. Not a warning bump, not a polite nudge. A full-speed head-on ram. The aluminum boat folded like a soda can as the shark slammed into it, flipping the vessel instantly and launching both men into the water. Larry surfaced first, sputtering, panicked, and suddenly aware of the fact that he had just insulted a very large predator in its own living room. His friend clung to the overturned boat screaming. Larry, unfortunately, was now swimming in the exact location where the angry shark had last been seen. The water exploded. There was a flash of gray, a violent splash, then a spreading red cloud in the water. Larry finally achieved his dream of an up-close encounter with marine wildlife. He simply ended up contributing to the ecosystem rather than studying it. In the grand food chain of the ocean, Larry had briefly been at the top. But that afternoon, he discovered something important. Bull sharks do not appreciate being tagged by amateurs, and they definitely do not respect research conducted from beer coolers and aluminum boats. 5. The man who slapped the most painful plant on Earth. In a quiet corner of England lived a gardener named Nigel, a man whose hobby was collecting plants that most reasonable people would prefer never to meet in a dark alley. Nigel was not interested in roses. Roses are predictable. Roses are safe. Nigel collected botanical nightmares. His garden was less a peaceful sanctuary and more a museum dedicated to things that could ruin your entire week if you touched them incorrectly. But the crown jewel of his collection was something truly special, a plant known as Dendrocnide moroides, better known by its far more honest nickname, the suicide plant. Native to Australia, this plant is covered in microscopic silica needles filled with an incredibly powerful neurotoxin. The tiny hairs inject venom into the skin that can cause pain so severe, victims have described it as being electrocuted and burned at the same time. The agony can last weeks, sometimes months. In rare cases, people have reportedly considered suicide just to escape the pain, which explains the name. Nigel, of course, thought all of this sounded great for conversation at garden parties. One summer afternoon, he invited several friends over to admire his unusual collection. As he proudly walked them through the garden, the group eventually arrived at the infamous plant sitting quietly in the corner like a green little demon waiting for a volunteer. Naturally, his friends reacted exactly the way sane people do when confronted with something nicknamed the suicide plant. They backed away. Slowly. One of them asked the obvious question, "You're not seriously keeping that thing here, are you, Nigel?" This was a mistake, because Nigel's ego immediately interpreted the question as a challenge. He scoffed. "Oh, please," he said, puffing out his chest with the kind of confidence normally reserved for people who have never experienced catastrophic pain. "All those stories are exaggerated. It's probably just a mild sting." His friends remained skeptical, and nothing motivates a stubborn man quite like the opportunity to prove his friends wrong. "You don't believe me?" Nigel declared. "Fine. Watch this." Before anyone could stop him, he rolled up the sleeve of his tweed jacket and marched directly toward the plant. In Nigel's mind, the plan was simple. Touch the leaf, feel a tiny prick, laugh at everyone, live the rest of his life as the brave man who defeated the world's most painful plant. Instead, Nigel made a small but very important modification to this plan. He didn't just touch the leaf, he slapped it hard. The result was instantaneous. Every pain receptor in his body fired at the exact same time, like a neurological fireworks show. Nigel's confident smirk disappeared faster than you can say, "terrible life decision." His lungs emptied in a single unholy scream that sounded less like a human voice and more like a kettle possessed by demons. The shock was overwhelming. The pain was catastrophic. And, unfortunately for Nigel, his heart had been quietly harboring a condition that was about to become very relevant. The sheer neurological overload caused his heart to seize like an engine filled with gravel. Nigel collapsed onto his perfectly maintained lawn, still clutching his arm. By the time paramedics arrived, it was already over. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, but everyone at the party understood the deeper truth. Nigel had died in the middle of a flex. He had attempted to win an argument with a plant, and the plant had responded with a flawless victory. In the long and glorious history of human arrogance, few battles have ended so quickly, or so painfully. 6. The man who fished with 20,000 volts. Deep in the Croatian countryside lived a man named Stepan, a local legend for two things. 1. Catching enormous amounts of fish. 2. Doing it in ways that made absolutely no sense to anyone who preferred to stay alive. While most fishermen use rods, nets, or bait, Stepan had developed what he believed was a far more efficient method: electricity. And not the small kind, the national power grid kind. Stepan owned a long insulated cable with a metal hook attached to one end. His routine was simple and horrifyingly effective. He would toss the hook over a high-voltage power line running near the riverbank. Then he would drop the other end of the cable into the water. The result was immediate. Tens of thousands of volts would surge into the river, instantly stunning or killing every fish within a large radius. Within seconds, fish would float to the surface like silver coins waiting to be collected. It was illegal, it was reckless, and for years, it worked. Which was exactly the problem. Success can turn a dangerous trick into a habit, and habits have a way of convincing people they are smarter than the laws of nature. Stepan bragged about his technique at the village tavern, describing himself as an innovator, while the rest of the town quietly wondered which power company employee would eventually have to scrape him off the riverbank. But after doing this stunt for years without incident, Stepan began to believe something very dangerous. He believed he had mastered electricity. Unfortunately, electricity does not have masters. Electricity has rules, and the most important rule is simple. Electricity always travels to the ground using the path of least resistance. The human body, being about 70% water, is an excellent conductor. On the day of his final fishing trip, the weather conditions were perfect for disaster. It had rained earlier, leaving the riverbank covered in slick mud. Stepan performed his usual ritual. Hook over the power line, cable in the river, fish floating everywhere. Business as usual. But as he began pulling the cable back toward himself, his boot slipped on the wet clay. Suddenly off balance, Stepan instinctively reached out to grab the nearest solid object to steady himself. That object happened to be the steel support structure of the power pylon. And in that exact moment, Stepan accidentally created the most efficient electrical circuit of his entire career. One hand gripping the live cable, the other hand touching the grounded metal tower. For a fraction of a second, his body became the perfect highway for 20,000 volts of electricity traveling straight to the earth. The current surged through him instantly. Witnesses later said the flash was visible from across the river. The sound was described as something between a loud pop and the sizzle of a steak hitting a hot pan. By the time the electricity finished its journey, Stepan's long and successful fishing career had come to a permanent conclusion. After years of cheating physics had finally collected its debt. The irony was almost poetic. Stepan had spent his life outsmarting fish, but in the end, he forgot something important. Fish don't understand electricity, but electricity understands everything. 7. The activist who protested a coal plant from the top of its smokestack. In the world of environmental activism, there are many ways to make a statement. Some people write letters, some organize protests, some chain themselves to trees. And then there was Frida, a woman whose definition of making a point involved climbing a 500-foot smokestack and sitting directly on top of the thing she hated most. Frida lived in Germany and had one clear enemy in life, a massive coal-fired power plant on the edge of her town. To her, it wasn't just an industrial facility. It was a monstrous steel dragon that she believed was personally poisoning the air and slowly suffocating the planet. Frida was not interested in polite activism. Petitions were boring. Marches were predictable. She wanted a gesture so dramatic that no one could possibly ignore it. Her plan was simple. She would climb the tallest smokestack of the plant and hang a giant banner that read, "Coal kills." Now, a quick science reminder. A smokestack is not just a tall chimney. It is a gigantic industrial pipeline designed specifically to carry concentrated exhaust gases, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and fine particulate pollution high into the air so they disperse farther away from the ground. In other words, it is literally the exit pipe of poison. Climbing one without protective gear is roughly equivalent to protesting sharks by swimming through the ocean covered in fish blood. But Frida was fueled by conviction, and conviction has a funny way of ignoring oxygen requirements. Early one morning, under the cover of darkness, she climbed the maintenance ladder that ran up the side of the smokestack. 500 feet later, she reached the top. The view was spectacular. Wind whipping through her hair, the sunrise stretching across the horizon. Below her, the power plant continued operating like a gigantic metal beast breathing out thick, gray exhaust. Frida unfolded her banner and proudly held it up to the sky. For a moment, it was exactly the statement she wanted. Photographers gathered below. Supporters cheered. She had conquered the symbol of pollution itself. And then she stayed there, for hours, breathing deeply. What Frida didn't fully appreciate was that the top of a smokestack is not a healthy place to meditate. It is the concentrated exit point of everything the plant is trying to get rid of. At first, she probably felt a small irritation in her throat, then dizziness, then nausea. The air she was breathing contained very little oxygen and a generous supply of toxic gases that the human body is not particularly fond of. As the hours passed, the chemicals began doing their work. Her muscles weakened, her head spun. The world around her slowly blurred into a gray haze. Ironically, the message on her banner, "Coal kills," was becoming a live demonstration. Eventually, her body simply couldn't keep functioning. Witnesses below later said she suddenly slumped forward and lost her grip. From 500 feet up, the fall was fast. The silence afterward was immediate. The power plant later issued a formal statement, expressing condolences and reminding the public of the dangers of prolonged exposure to industrial emissions. In a twist of dark irony, Frida had successfully proven her point. Coal really does kill. She just demonstrated it personally. 8. The man who tried to vacuum an entire hornet nest. In Texas, where people take pride in solving problems themselves, there lived a man named Dale. Dale was a devoted believer in the philosophy of DIY problem solving. Plumbing problem? Fix it yourself. Electrical issue? Probably YouTube can help. Dangerous insects living inside your house? Clearly, the solution involves power tools. So when Dale discovered a hornet's nest in his attic roughly the size of a watermelon, he did not call an exterminator. Calling professionals costs money. Dale preferred innovation. His solution came from the corner of his garage, a powerful 6.5 horsepower industrial shop vacuum. In Dale's mind, the logic was flawless. Why bother with sprays, chemicals, or protective suits when you could simply apply overwhelming suction? He would vacuum the entire nest and all the hornets inside it. Problem solved. And to be fair to Dale, the first half of the plan actually worked. Wearing what could generously be described as a homemade beekeeper suit, a raincoat, gloves, and a motorcycle helmet, he climbed into the attic, turned on the roaring vacuum, and began the operation. The hose swallowed hornets like a tornado eating paper. Thousands of furious insects were sucked into the plastic canister as Dale laughed triumphantly inside his helmet. For about 5 minutes, he looked like a genius. The attic eventually went silent. The nest was gone. The hornets were gone. Inside the vacuum canister was now a swirling, buzzing container holding several thousand extremely angry insects. Dale shut off the machine and climbed down from the attic feeling victorious. And that's when the fatal flaw in the plan appeared. He now owned a bucket full of hornets. The buzzing from inside the vacuum was deafening. It sounded like a tiny engine of rage preparing for revenge. Dale stared at the container for a long moment. What exactly was Phase 2? He couldn't leave it in the attic. He couldn't throw it in the trash. Eventually, his brain produced the only idea it had left. He would open the container outside and run. Fast. This plan assumed two things. First, that Dale was extremely fast. Second, that hornets were slow. Both of these assumptions turned out to be catastrophically wrong. He carried the vacuum canister into the backyard, placed it on the grass, and knelt down beside it. With a deep breath, he unlatched the lid. The moment it opened, the hornets erupted. Not a swarm, a storm. Thousands of furious insects exploded into the air like a biological grenade. Dale attempted to run. He made it approximately 3 feet. Within seconds, the swarm covered him completely. Hornets do not attack politely. They attack repeatedly. Hundreds of stings, then hundreds more. His raincoat and motorcycle helmet offered about as much protection as a napkin in a hurricane. By the time paramedics arrived, the backyard was quiet again. The hornets had moved on. The shop vacuum sat peacefully on the grass, still warm from the operation. Dale had technically solved the hornet problem, but in the process, the hornets had solved their Dale problem even more effectively. 9. The man who tried to navigate fog using echoes. The Scottish Highlands are famous for 3 things: beautiful landscapes, unpredictable weather, and the occasional tourist who dramatically overestimates his own intelligence. One afternoon, a group of hikers found themselves deep in the hills when a thick fog rolled in without warning. Within minutes, the world vanished. Mountains disappeared. Trails disappeared. Even the ground a few feet ahead became difficult to see. The group did what experienced hikers usually do in this situation. They stopped moving. Because when visibility drops to zero in mountainous terrain, wandering around blindly is a fantastic way to discover gravity the hard way. But one man in the group, Alistair, had a different philosophy. Alistair considered himself what he liked to call a natural navigator. He didn't trust maps, he didn't trust compasses, and he definitely didn't trust the cautious advice of the people around him. In his mind, he possessed a deep instinctive connection with nature that allowed him to find his way without tools, which is a lovely theory, right up until the moment you test it in a fog-covered mountain range. As the group discussed waiting for the fog to clear, Alistair suddenly had an idea. Not a good idea, but definitely an idea. He would navigate using echoes. Yes, like a bat. Now, echolocation is a real thing. Bats and dolphins use sound waves to determine the location of objects around them. But they also possess extremely specialized brains and biological systems designed specifically for interpreting those sound reflections. Alistair had none of those. What he did have was confidence. His plan was simple. He would shout into the fog and walk toward the direction where the echo sounded strongest. The others immediately realized what this meant. He wasn't navigating away from obstacles. He was navigating toward them. "Mate, that's the sound bouncing off something," one hiker tried to explain. "You're literally walking toward whatever you're yelling at." Alistair smiled the way people smile when they believe everyone else in the room is stupid. "You have to listen to the subtleties," he said confidently. Then he shouted into the fog. "Hello!" A moment later, a faint hello echoed back. "Aha," Alistair said proudly. "That way." He began walking straight into the fog. His friends watched in disbelief. He repeated the process every few steps. "Hello!" Echo. "See? Getting clearer," he called back. What Alistair didn't realize was that the reason the echo was getting stronger was because he was getting closer to the surface, reflecting the sound. A very large one. Hidden in the fog ahead was a steep rock cliff that dropped hundreds of feet into a ravine below. As Alistair moved forward, the echo became sharper and faster. To him, this meant progress. To everyone else, it sounded like a countdown. He shouted one last time. The echo came back instantly. "Almost there," he yelled. And then he took one more step. The next sound his friends heard was not an echo. It was a scream. One that did not bounce back, because it had gone straight down. Alistair had successfully used echolocation to locate the cliff with remarkable accuracy. Unfortunately, he discovered it from the wrong side. 10. The gamer who took virtual reality a little too seriously. Technology has done many amazing things for humanity. We can talk across continents instantly. We can explore distant planets. And we can simulate zombie apocalypses from the comfort of our living rooms. For Dmitry, a young man living in Moscow, virtual reality gaming had become more than just entertainment. It was immersion. Dmitry owned one of the most advanced VR setups available. A high-end headset that blocked out all outside light, noise-canceling headphones, and a hyper-realistic survival game designed to make players feel like they were truly fighting for their lives. Inside the game, the world was a ruined city crawling with zombies. Inside his apartment, the world was a couch, a coffee table, and several extremely sharp pieces of furniture. Unfortunately for Dmitry, the human brain is very good at believing what it sees. After an hour of gameplay, he was no longer a guy in an apartment. He was a survivor in a collapsing world. Heart racing, adrenaline pumping. Every sound in the headphones felt real. Every shadow looked like danger. And then the game triggered a classic jump scare. A zombie lunged at him from behind a shelf. Dmitry reacted exactly the way the game designers hoped he would. He dodged. Not with a controller, with his entire body. He threw himself backward in panic, attempting to escape the digital monster. Inside the game, this was a brilliant survival move. Inside his living room, it was a catastrophic collision with reality. Behind him sat a large glass coffee table, the kind made from thick, elegant glass panels that look stylish in furniture catalogs but behave very differently when someone crashes into them at full speed. Dmitri slammed directly into it. The table shattered instantly. He fell backward into a bed of razor-sharp glass shards. But the situation was about to get even worse, because Dmitri did not realize what had happened. His brain was still inside the game. In the virtual world, his character had been knocked to the ground and was now fighting off a zombie in a desperate final struggle. A prompt appeared in front of his eyes. Stab upward repeatedly to survive. To Dmitri, this was a command. Still fully convinced he was battling a zombie, he began violently thrusting his arms upward over and over again. In the game, he was fighting. In reality, he was lying in shattered glass. Every frantic movement pushed the jagged shards deeper into his back, shoulders, and arms. Adrenaline kept him moving. Pain barely registered. By the time the headset finally powered down, Dmitri had already lost too much blood. When authorities arrived later, the scene was almost surreal. A man lying in a destroyed living room, a shattered table, a VR headset still displaying the digital world he had been fighting so hard to survive. Dmitri had successfully defeated the zombies, but he had lost the battle against his own furniture. And there you have it, 10 people who looked at terrible ideas and thought, yeah, that should work. No mysterious forces, no tragic coincidences, just ordinary humans armed with confidence, bad judgment, and a complete misunderstanding of how the world works. In every story tonight, the warning signs were there. The physics was predictable, the outcome was inevitable. But ego has a funny way of convincing people they are the one exception to every rule. They had a plan. Physics had one too. And physics has never lost an argument. If you enjoyed this tour through the Darwin Awards Hall of Fame, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who occasionally says, "Relax, I know what I'm doing." Because statistically speaking,